The year 2019 in professional wrestling was unfortunately filled with loss, as the fraternities and sororities of the industry lost a number of gifted stars, cherished performers, and rising hopefuls. As we turn the calendar year over into a new decade, let us take a look back at those figures of the squared circle the world said goodbye to in 2019. Jim Evans. Evans was a regular enhancement talent of WWE throughout the late 80s and early 90s, appearing in more than 60 televised matches for the promotion against the likes of Macho Man Randy Savage, Ted DiBiase, Mr. Perfect, and others. He also wrestled for the AWA in the company's dying years and performed for Midwest-based indies into the 2000s under the name Heartbreaker Trevor Adonis. Mean Gene Okerlund. Unquestionably wrestling's foremost backstage interviewer, the famed Mean Gene was also an announcer and TV host, as well as an occasional wrestler. His dry, razor-sharp wit, natural gravitas, and innate ability to ad-lib matched him well with scores of colourful characters throughout his near 5 decades in the business. Okerlund spent 14 years with the American Wrestling Association before joining the World Wrestling Federation in late 1983, where he became a household name and part of the global lexicon through his many two shots with friend Hulk Hogan. He later joined WCW after a 10-year stint in New York and remained with the company until its 2001 closure. Since then, Okerlund worked on and off with WWE in the years that followed as something of a host emeritus. Alexis Smirnoff. This French-Canadian mauler found new life in 1977 as a Russian brute, establishing himself as a star on the West Coast by defeating Pat Patterson for the San Francisco version of the NWA United States title that year. Smirnoff also made a strong name for himself in Japan in the late 70s and early 80s, feuding with IWA World Heavyweight Champion Rusher Kimura and wrestling extensively in All Japan. He also worked West Coast events for WWE in the early to mid-80s. Mike Hammer. A mainstay of Stampede wrestling throughout the 80s, Hammer wrestled under a number of eclectic names, including Dr. Blood and Buddy Frankenstein. Despite the colourful monikers, Hammer was often used in an enhancement talent role, losing to Bruce Hart, Chris Benoit, and Jim Neidhart, among others. He later became a prolific artist in the St. Louis area. Dr. Rex Backus. Backus began his wrestling career late, having his first match in 2015 at age 31. A Florida-based tag team wrestler, Backus competed locally for Evolve and Full Impact Pro in 2016, as well as for Major League Wrestling 2 months before his passing from cancer. Alex Perry. Perry competed in various Florida independents over his brief career, including American Combat Wrestling, Tampa Bay Pro Wrestling, and Real Pro Wrestling, as well as the NWA's Florida Wrestling Alliance. He held the definitive Wrestling International Light Heavyweight belt for several weeks in 2016. Tom Ivey. Alabama-born son of a deacon only wrestled for a brief spell in the early to mid-80s, but worked for several major groups, including AWA, Mid-South, and All Japan. In the latter, Ivy actually competed for the vacated All-Asia Tag Team titles in 1984 alongside Champagne Jerry Morrow. Stateside, he wrestled as the Black Panther in AWA TV jobs against Rick Martel, Ken Patera, and Hulk Hogan. Otto Bahn. This diminutive manager stood only 4'11" tall, but made an impression upon the Ontario independent scene as a loudmouthed, fast-talking second for various heels of the territory in the late 90s and early 2000s. The verbose manager also had a brief role in a televised biopic about the life of Jesse Ventura. Belladonna. Belladonna worked for a time as the valet of the Disciples of the New Church in the very early days of Impact Wrestling. She debuted in November 2002 during the match in which Church members Slash and Brian Lee defeated America's Most Wanted for the TNA World Tag Team titles. Later, she actually wrestled both members of America's Most Wanted in a handicap bull rope match before departing in early 2003. Les Thornton. Six-time NWA Junior Heavyweight Champion, traded the belt with the likes of Terry Taylor, Gerald Briscoe, and Joe Lightfoot throughout the early 80s. Thornton toured the globe as one of the preeminent junior heavyweight grapplers of his era, wrestling the likes of Tiger Mask, Dynamite Kid, and Tatsumi Fujinami, while having extensive runs in Japan, Calgary, and the American territories, as well as World of Sport. He was also acclaimed as a legitimate shooter, having trained in Wigan's notorious Snake Pit, with harsh strikes and permeating realness evident in his work. Salvatore Bellomo. The Belgian-born heavyweight traded on various Italian handles as a wrestler, though he had greatest success under the Bellomo name. He wrestled throughout Europe and Canada, and had a several-year stint in WWE in the early to mid-80s, where he played a mostly underneath babyface, though he did challenge Iron Sheik during the Sheik's brief world title reign. He later served as a trainer and promoter, with Aleister Black working for him early in his own career. Koji Kitao. This looming sumo prodigy and former Yokozuna became a professional wrestler in 1989 after a well-publicized fallout from the sumo world. Kitao trained at the New Japan Dojo, but was later fired from New Japan after an incident with Riki Choshu. He turned to Genichiro Tenryu's Super World of Sports in the early 90s, and even competed at WrestleMania 7 as part of a cross-promotion 1 week before his infamous shoot with Earthquake at SWS Wrestle Dream. Pedro Morales. A seminal figure in WWE history, becoming the first Latino to hold world singles gold in the territory. Morales reigned as world champion for nearly 3 years between February 1971 and December 1973, selling out Madison Square Garden 21 times among his 30 title defenses in the building. During said reign, he wrestled fellow babyface star Bruno Sammartino to a 65-minute draw at Shea Stadium in 1972. Morales also holds the distinction of becoming the first Triple Crown champion in WWE history, upon his winning of the Intercontinental Championship from Ken Patera in late 1980. Glories outside of WWE came in California, twice reigning as WWA World Champion and twice holding AWA's San Francisco tag titles with Pepper Gomez. Honest John Cheatham. Cheatham worked primarily as the manager of Abdullah the Butcher during the latter part of Abdullah's career, mostly in American and Canadian indies. He also served as a manager and broadcaster for the Georgia-based NWA Wildside promotion in the late 90s and early 2000s. Cliff Sheets. Sheets wrestled mostly in Florida throughout the 90s and into the early part of the 2000s, most regularly in the Future of Wrestling promotion with partner Casey Thompson as the Exterminators. Sheets worked a number of bouts for WWE and WCW as an enhancement talent throughout the early 90s, and later wrestled Steve Blackman on an episode of Jacked in 2000. King Kong Bundy. This gargantuan villain and Heenan family cornerstone received considerable acclaim as enemy of Hulkamania, challenging for Hulk Hogan's WWE title in the main event of WrestleMania 2 in 1986. Bundy began his career in territories such as Mid-South and World Class, the latter of which he faced Fritz Von Erich in 1982 at Texas Stadium in what was billed as Von Erich's retirement match. Bundy's greatest career fame came in WWE, where he, aside from headlining WrestleMania 2, memorably flattened SD Jones in the first WrestleMania, crunched mini wrestler Little Beaver 2 years later, and became the fourth notch in Undertaker's WrestleMania streak in 1995. His trademark was the 5 count he demanded from referees to demonstrate the thoroughness of his dominance. The Destroyer. This grappling great and cultural icon made an indelible mark on 2 separate continents, carving out an unparalleled legacy across 39 years as an active wrestler, ranking among the most famed and celebrated masked wrestlers of all time. Some of Dick Byer's most memorable matches came against Freddie Blassie and Giant Baba, but it was his May 1963 match with Ricky Dozan that is most historic, viewed by 70 million viewers on Japanese TV. He later helped popularize All Japan Pro Wrestling throughout the 70s, particularly in his long rivalry with Mil Mascaras. Destroyer also bolstered his visibility in the country on primetime Japanese comedy show Uwasa no Channel, and later received the Order of the Rising Sun for his high relevance to Japanese culture. In America, he held the WWA World title on 3 occasions, the AWA World title once, and across the Pacific won All Japan's now defunct PWF US Heavyweight title 4 times. Wally Yamaguchi. The The man, also known as Yamaguchi-san, gained considerable fame among WWE fans as the animated manager of Kaientai in 1998, though his influence in the business extends further. He helped found the unconventional frontier martial arts wrestling promotion a decade earlier, as well as Japanese wrestling publication Gong Magazine. He is perhaps best known for the farcical angle involving the attempted dismemberment of Val Venus on WWE Raw. Roger Kirby. Kirby was a former NWA Junior Heavyweight Champion, beating the legendary Danny Hodge for the championship in New Orleans in 1971. He traded upon the Nature Boy handle previously made famous by Buddy Rogers and held championships across various NWA territories throughout the 70s and early 80s. He was most at home in Kansas City's Central States Wrestling, where he held the region's heavyweight title on 5 occasions. Larry Cheatham. Moondog was something of a mainstay for Ole Anderson's Georgia Championship Wrestling in the late 70s and early 80s, with appearances in Jim Crockett's Carolina territory and Bill Watts' Mid-South Wrestling. He was also a regular in Nashville and Memphis in that era, sometimes wrestling as Zebra Kid No. 2. Vicky Funk. Vicky was high school sweetheart and eventual wife of over 54 years to the legendary Terry Funk. She appeared alongside her husband in the influential 1999 documentary Beyond the Mat, front and center during both Terry's difficulties and triumphs. She also co-owned the famed Double Cross Ranch with her husband, which earned regular mention as part of his on-screen hometown. Colton Quest. America's Best proved a steady hand in the Delaware-based Right Coast Pro, where he wrestled exclusively during his 6-year career after turning pro at age 17. Quest reigned as the promotion's heavyweight champion at the time of his passing. Al Wilson. The father of Tori gained rather tongue-in-cheek infamy for a 2002 SmackDown storyline in which he was seduced by Tori's rival Dawn Marie, resulting in some truly surreal television. Wilson wound up marrying Dawn in the angle, resulting in Dawn causing his death via sex-induced heart attack. His real-life passing sadly occurred 2 days before his daughter's induction into WWE's Hall of Fame. Tony the Annihilator. Big Tony wrestled primarily in the Wisconsin area throughout the 1990s, with notable opponents that included Jim Brunzell and former WWE tag team the Beverly Brothers. He was also a Gold Gloves boxer, as well as a competitor in strongman contests. Big John Quinn. This Canadian-born powerhouse toured the world, becoming a star throughout Europe. Quinn held the British heavyweight title 4 times and headlined a monumental Wembley Arena card in 1980 against Big Daddy. He was also a former 3-time Stampede North American champion and 9-time holder of NWA All-Star Wrestling's Canadian tag team belts. Quinn wrestled for a time as Virgil the Kentucky Butcher for the then WWF, unsuccessfully challenging perennial champion Bruno Sammartino in Texas death matches in the late 60s. Eric Chappell. A veteran of Pennsylvania and Maryland-based indies, Chappell primarily worked for American Championship Pro Wrestling and Maryland Championship Wrestling, the latter of which he performed for regularly in the final 4 years of his career. He reigned on several occasions as MCW Tag Team Champion with partner Dirty Money, even facing the Hardy Boys in a title match in 2017. Silver King. The skillful son of Dr. Wagner competed across all the major promotions of Mexico, including AAA, UWA, and CMLL. King's partnership with El Texano as Los Cowboys yielded tag team gold across multiple companies. He performed in WCW's Cruiserweight division in the late 90s, including a title bout with Juventud Guerrera at the 1998 Fall Brawl. Overseas, Silver King won All Japan Pro Wrestling's World Junior Heavyweight title in 2008 and competed for a time in New Japan as the third incarnation of Black Tiger. He also earned cinematic fame as Ramses, the main villain of 2005 Jack Black comedy Nacho Libre. Ashley Mazzaro. The 2005 WWE Diva Search winner was immediately thrust into storylines, teaming with Trish Stratus in a rivalry with Victoria, Tori Wilson, and Candice Michelle. Later, Mazzaro was caught in the middle of Mickie James's aggressive pursuing of Stratus. She performed at 2 WrestleManias, including in a women's title match against Melina at WrestleMania 23, and she briefly managed SmackDown Tag Team Champions Paul London and Brian Kendrick. Charles Martoni. A regular in Pittsburgh's studio wrestling of the 60s and early 70s, Martoni mostly worked under his real name, but also competed as the cloaked Masked Marvel. He later became the mayor of Swissville, Pennsylvania, and was still a presiding councilman for Pennsylvania's Allegheny County at the time of his death. René Goulet. The #1 Frenchman patronized the AWA and WWE throughout the early 70s and early 80s, becoming part of the second World Tag Team Champions in WWE history alongside Carl Scotch in 1971. Goulet co-won what is today the New Japan World Tag Team League alongside Andre the Giant in 1981. He spent his final years as a wrestler in WWE's undercard, working with future stars such as Bret Hart and the British Bulldogs. Goulet remained with the company into 1997 as a backstage agent, often visible on camera taking part in many pull-apart brawls and skirmishes. Lyle C. Williams. Williams was a beloved Philadelphia-based photographer who worked the tri-state scene for many years. He diligently captured iconic images from Ring of Honor, Combat Zone Wrestling, and other local promotions in the post-ECW world, many of which are still disseminated today. Atsushi Aoki. Aoki reigned as All Japan's World Junior Heavyweight Champion for a third time when he passed. A protege of Jun Akiyama, Aoki twice held Pro Wrestling Noah's Junior Heavyweight Tag Team belts with partners Kotaro Suzuki and Naomichi Marufuji. He also co-won the 2010 Nippon TV Cup Junior Heavyweight Tag League with Kenta, and later held All Japan's All Asia Tag Team titles on 3 occasions. Aoki later worked in talent relations for All Japan and trained wrestlers at the promotion's dojo. Jim Richardson. The hanging judge was a regular in the Von Erich's world-class territory during its final run in the late 80s, and for wrestler/booker Ken Mantell. He teamed with cousin Gunner Will Hitch as the Texas Outlaws, and also booked for small promotions in the Texas area. Lionheart. Lionheart was a top champion for various UK promotions, including One Pro Wrestling, Preston City Wrestling, and Insane Championship Wrestling, the latter of which he was still world champion of at the time of his passing. He gained unintended fame after his neck was broken during a 2014 match with AJ Styles following a botched Styles clash. Ultimately, Lionheart defied doctor's orders to retire, making an emotional return 1 year later. Among his numerous high-profile matches, Lionheart challenged ROH champion Nigel McGuinness in a 3-way match during a 1PW event in 2008. Buck Ramstead. A former collegiate wrestler at the University of Minnesota, Ramstead transitioned into the professional ranks under the tutelage of Vern Gagne. Though he began his career in the AWA, Ramstead adopted the Pacific Northwest as his home territory for his remaining decade in the sport. He held the NWA Canadian Championship for a time while wrestling as the masked Mr. Pro. Max Muscle. Muscle, as the name may suggest, was a professional bodybuilder that made the transition into wrestling in 1992, working as Big Bad John for the Dallas-based Global Wrestling Federation. He ended up in WCW the following year as a peripheral player, eventually becoming Diamond Dallas Page's imposing bodyguard in 1995. Muscle later feuded with Page before playing out his tenure as part of the Dungeon of Doom. Jacques Rougeau. Rougeau was the patriarch of the esteemed Rougeau wrestling family that took root in Quebec as a squared circle dynasty. A Gold Gloves boxer turned pro wrestler in the mid-50s, Rougeau often teamed with his brother Johnny. As a headliner and frequent IWA international champion, Rougeau did tremendous business at the Montreal Forum alongside a cadre of villains that included Abdullah the Butcher, The Sheik, and Ivan Koloff, among others. Additionally, Rougeau was a regular in New Japan Pro Wrestling in the 70s, a tenure that included a few singles bouts with Antonio Inoki. His 3 sons, Raymond, Armand, and Jacques Jr., later became wrestlers and teamed with their father in a pair of 8-man tag bouts in July 1984. Perro Aguayo. Among the absolute top draws in the history of Lucha Libre, Aguayo was best known for his untamed fighting style and his ability to take copious amounts of punishment. Considered the last great rivalry of the legendary El Santo, Aguayo wagered his hair against the mask of the cultural icon in a famed 1975 bout. He remained a major draw into the 90s, as evidenced by 6 consecutive sellouts at Arena Mexico for his feud with Conan. He was a famed 3-time NWA middleweight champion, with one of Aguayo's reigns lasting 476 days. Aguayo helped found the AAA promotion in the early 90s, serving as one of its top stars from the go. Poco Alonso. This third-generation executive was the longtime president of the CMLL promotion in Mexico, manning the position from 1987 until his passing. Alonso was well known for being a hands-off owner, allowing his matchmakers and bookers to handle the wrestling end while he remained something of a private and elusive figure. Alonso previously worked in a promotional capacity for the then EMLL in the 70s, while Father Chavo oversaw the company. He's been credited for maintaining a consistently profitable promotion throughout his 3 decades at the helm. Billy Ray Hickerson, a Tennessee native who competed throughout various southern indies, including USWA, IWA Mid-South, and various NWA affiliates. Hickerson also competed under a mask as part of the tag team Fire and Flame. He won the Pro Wrestling Mid-South Championship in late 2003, holding it into early 2005. Harley Race, the greatest wrestler on God's green earth, was revered and respected, the gold standard of pro wrestling throughout the latter generation of the Territory era. Race held the NWA World Heavyweight title 8 times between 1973 and 1984, exchanging it in famed bouts with Terry Funk, Dusty Rhodes, and Ric Flair. With partner Larry Hennig, Race held the AWA World Tag Team titles on 3 occasions, memorably feuding with the Bruiser and the Crusher. He headlined the inaugural Starrcade in 1983, dropping the title to Flair, and doing so in spite of a lucrative offer from Vince McMahon to sabotage the card by no showing. Race later joined WWE as The King, which was reinforced by winning the 1986 King of the Ring tournament. He feuded with Hulk Hogan, Jim Duggan, Junkyard Dog, and others in the latter half of the 80s. Race also became the first man to hold the belt that today carries the lineage of the WWE United States title, capturing the gold in 1975. Also a heralded promoter and trainer, Race had a hand in the development of Barry Windham, Tommaso Ciampa, Trevor Murdoch, Curtis Axel, Ted DiBiase Jr., Richie Steamboat, and Bobby Fish, among many more. Alex Rain. Rain was a fixture of Manitoba's independent scene through the latter half of the 90s and well into the mid-2000s, mostly for the NWA-affiliated Canadian Wrestling Federation. He held the NWA North American title for 1 month in 2001 and was among the earliest opponents for current Raw superstar Eric Young when the latter was coming up in the sport. Dango Wynn. Perhaps better known for his time as a villainous guard on The Walking Dead, Wynn also wrestled professionally in the 90s and 2000s. A childhood friend of Rob Van Dam, he wrestled under the Wynn name as well as Gemini in Georgia-based independents including NWA Wildside and Anarchy Wrestling. Wynn also served Athens, Clarke County, Georgia as a firefighter for 20 years. Jerry Hogarth. Hogarth is believed to have been the oldest living professional wrestler at the time of his passing. A former British heavyweight champion, Hogarth retired from the ring in 1959, later serving as a referee and promoter. He was one of the very earliest opponents of Shirley Crabtree, the future Big Daddy. The Wrestling Pro. This masked menace's peak years in the 70s saw him rack up championships in Florida and the Gulf Coast. A multi-time NWA Gulf Coast Tag Team Champion, the Pro also held the NWA Junior Heavyweight belt and Mid-South Area North American title, and challenged for Jack Briscoe's NWA World Heavyweight crown. He wore a mask to conceal his identity as he worked in law enforcement, before finally unmasking at a 2004 convention appearance. Eddie Marlin. Marlin began wrestling in his 20s, though it remained a secondary part of his life until assuming a fuller role in the business in his late 30s, wrestling under a mask as the Mummy for NWA Mid-America. The father-in-law of Jerry Jarrett and grandfather of Jeff held numerous territorial tag team titles alongside Tommy Gilbert and Tojo Yamamoto. Marlin portrayed an on-screen babyface commissioner for Memphis's Continental Territory throughout the 1980s, even returning to the ring for matches against former partner Gilbert in 1988. Norman Frederick Charles III. Charles partnered with cousin Jonathan Boyd as the Royal Kangaroos, winning the NWA Pacific Northwest Tag Team titles on 6 occasions between 1971 and 1976. He also held other championships with Boyd, including the NWA International Tag Team titles in Stampede. While in Stampede, Charles won the British Commonwealth Mid-Heavyweight Championship on 3 occasions. His final years in Stampede were spent as a foil to the Hart family, most notably siblings Brett and Bruce, as well as a young Dynamite Kid. John Chambers. A former police officer who didn't take to wrestling until he was in his mid-30s, Chambers competed primarily in the Georgia area for several NWA affiliates, holding the Southern Wrestling Federation's American Heavyweight title. Personas used by Chambers included Gunnery Sergeant Chambers, Colonel John Murdoch, and the Russian Assassin. Dr. Caronte. This masked luchador fathered 5 sons that all eventually became wrestlers themselves, including Argenis, Caristico, Astro Boy, Argos, and Dr. Caronte Jr. Caronte began his career in the early 60s and also wrestled under the name Manuel Almanza. Michael Ray Porter. Porter owned and operated Main Event Wrestling, or NWA Main Event, in Nashville from 2000 until its 2012 closure, which at times included appearances from Cedric Alexander, James Storm, Taylor Hendricks, and Brian Christopher. He also promoted shows in Georgia and Kentucky during his time running the company. Fernand Frechette. This Quebec native began wrestling as a teenager in the late 50s before finding steady work under a mask as one of the Green Hornets for Johnny Rougeau in 1969. Frechette later donned a different mask and costume as the Scorpion, wrestling all over Canada and in Japan's IWE promotion before retiring in 1983. Big Titan. This Canadian powerhouse formed a potent title-winning duo with the equally looming Gladiator, aka Mike Awesome, in Japan's FMW promotion in the early 90s. Titan toured in other international promotions such as the German/Austrian Catch Wrestling Association and the War promotion in Japan. He gained notoriety for his 1996 run in WWE, in which the 6'6" heavyweight was repackaged as the imposter Razor Ramon. Giant Gustav. This mammoth super heavyweight was known for his immense frame and abnormally large hands. A pupil of Edouard Carpentier, Gustav debuted in the mid-80s and had a brief run through New Japan Pro Wrestling, decimating foes in handicap matches. He went on to have a career in film, appearing in wrestle-centric No Holds Barred, as well as 2016's X-Men Apocalypse. Matt Travis. A student of the Amazing Red, Travis wrestled for Northeastern Indies such as House of Glory and Game Changer Wrestling, as well as several matches for CZW in 2019, representing House of Glory in a promotional war. Select opponents from Travis's brief time in the business include Homicide, Jimmy Rave, and Private Party. An AEW Dynamite match pitting Private Party against Santana and Ortiz from November was dedicated to his memory. Moondog Rex. This woolly brawler worked the Southeastern Territories throughout the 70s, including a stint as one of the Assassins, and later captured tag team gold in WWE with Moondog King in 1981. He gained his most fame as the bone-gnawing Moondog, working the gimmick well into the 90s, though he did find success outside the role in Mid-South in 1985, winning the North American title as the Nightmare. Rex portrayed the original Demolition Smash in early 1987, before his obvious identity led to WWE replacing him with Barry Darsow. And finally, Mr. Niebla. An animated, physically exuberant lucha icon, Niebla's comedic performances ran parallel to championship glory, including a 500-plus day reign as CMLL heavyweight champion in 2003 to 2004. He made CMLL his primary home from 1995 until his passing, save for 16 months spent in AAA in 2007 to 2008. Niebla formed La Pesta Negra, aka the Black Plague, with Negro Casas and others in 2008, enduring in various incarnations to the present day. He successfully defended his mask on at least 9 occasions in matches throughout the 90s. Niebla also held tag team and trios gold in CMLL alongside the likes of Shocker, Atlantis, Black Warrior, and Lizmark. We at Cultaholic pay tribute and give thanks to all of those on this list for their contributions to professional wrestling.
Thanks for watching. Let us know what you think in the comments down below. You can follow us on Twitter at Cultaholic. You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/Cultaholic. If you enjoy what we do here at Cultaholic, you can pledge to us on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Cultaholic. And most importantly, don't forget to hit subscribe and join us.